Thank you for that introduction, David, and I'm very pleased to be talking to you all this evening. Sorry, in a sense, not to be seeing you in person, but Zoom does make these things possible in a way that we couldn't think about even a few years ago. And in many ways, the origin of the work that I'm going to talk to you about this evening is another byproduct of COVID. Many years ago, as David has said, when Geoff Cole was excavating at South Farm, Lightwater in the 1980s, I visited the site fairly frequently, and some of our students dug there. And after the end of the excavation in 1992, I also worked for a couple of weeks over 2 successive Easters with groups of students working on studying the Iron Age and Roman pottery from the site. And I passed an archive report on that pottery to Geoff Cole, according to my notes, in 1998, at the stage that Geoff was supposedly working on writing the site up. As you'll probably be aware, Geoff died about 6 years after that, and the trust has worked very hard to get the archive into order and sort fines and so forth out. So at the beginning of the COVID lockdown, one of the things that I thought I could do working from home was quickly put together the notes that I'd got with the pottery, with material that I had on file from Geoff. And I thought it was going to be relatively straightforward and quick to write this site up. As it has emerged, it's been a rather more complicated and time-consuming process. And what I'm going to do for you this evening is to give you the results of that work over what's probably become the last 3 years, which has involved both members of the volunteers at the Trust, myself working in Cambridge, and Sarah Painter from Historic England, as now is, the lab in Portsmouth, who has been doing work, again, going back to the early 2000s, on the iron slag from the site. And I'm very grateful to Sarah for allowing me to sort of talk a little bit about the work she's done for this project this evening. And where we are now is that I have actually today received the last of the corrected drawings from my illustrator, and I've sent Teresa, who's online with us this evening, and Sarah a draft of the report that now just needs the iron slag work bringing in and a little bit of work on the querns. So what I'm going to do is to run you through what we understand of the site now and what its implications are. I'm aware that as David said, although I started my archaeological life in this part of the country, brought up in Farnham, so forth, I'm a little bit rusty on some of the more recent work in the area. So I'd be very grateful in questions and comments at the end for any feedback that gives parallels and so forth for what we're going to see. Now, for those of you who aren't aware of the location of the site, site, and I hope you could see my pointer, is in the Windlesham Arboretum here, just by the M3 junction. And it's a site that lies on the edge of the bagshot beds, sort of gravels, overlooking the Windle Brook that runs basically through here. So it's on the edge of the plateau overlooking Brook. And the basic story of the site is that when work on the preparation of the ground for the Arboretum was being done in the early 1980s. Geoff Cole and members of the Surrey Archaeological Society went and field walked the area and picked up quite a large concentration of Roman pottery, which led to trial trenching and subsequently quite a big excavation. And the excavation, as we see it, developed through several years. It was initially focused on the core area that we're going to come back to here, but it spread out, exploring areas as time went on. Geoff, who you can see here in, I think, the initial season on the site with Paul Stokes, developed the excavation as a really very good and interesting project that involved large numbers of volunteers and school children. He established a Young Archaeologists Club branch on the site, drew in lots and lots of volunteers from the region and students, as I say, from Durham. And alongside the excavation, Paul Stokes developed a lot of very interesting educational work. There were experiments in pot manufacture, iron smelting, and so forth that went on. It was a very vibrant group of people. And it's very interesting to know that quite a number of those school children and students went on to careers in archaeology. The site itself was, for the time, I think, really very well excavated. It worked through a series of summer season excavations with the areas covered up in between, not backfilled. The soil, those of you who worked in this sort of part of Surrey will be aware, is absolutely horrible. It's gravel and sands on top of clay, and going through the site slides, you can see that even during the summers, it became waterlogged and flooded on a number of occasions. But despite those sort of logistic difficulties, the excavation covered a pretty large area. I think it's sort of about 5,000 square meters in total. These were stripped by machine, the top 20 centimeters or so, and then excavated by hand. The site was recorded. Geoff was an architectural surveyor, so the surveying was really very high standard, and his plan drawing, when he did the plans himself, was equally high in quality. It was recorded then sort of state-of-the-art single context recording, although there are, as I think with all excavations, variations in the records that survive. The two difficulties we face in bringing the excavation to publication, aside from, as David said, it's always very difficult getting inside the head of an excavator and understanding the site if you weren't there all the time. But the two problems we faced is that, firstly, in the first few years of the excavation, really down to 1989, 1990, a lot of work was done between the excavation seasons in sorting out phasing, drawing a matrix, and writing interim reports. In the last 3 years of excavation, that doesn't seem to have been done, or if it was done, the records haven't survived. So it's when I started out on the project, I hadn't appreciated that quite a large chunk of the site hadn't fully been phased. The second challenge for the excavation is looking here at the central part of the site and knowing what I know now, I'm pretty sure that they didn't get to the bottom of the sequence over a lot of the area. In this central area, we have a good sequence going back into the Iron Age. In the more peripheral areas, I suspect that more needed to be taken off at the apparent subsoil level, and we're missing bits of the earlier stages. So what I have done in drawing the stratigraphic side together is to start off from Geoff's phasing of the early seasons of excavation, and I've tied that into the pottery sequence that we recorded in the 1990s with students. I should say that that pottery work was done as a sort of evaluation exercise with student trainees, and there's very little doubt that if you went back to the something like 5,000 sherds of pottery that are available from the site, it would be possible now to get more out of it, but I don't think we're reopening the case. For the later seasons, where we hadn't seen the pottery in the mid-1990s, I have simply done a spot dating of the pottery. I've opened every bag, made a note of the fabrics and so forth, and classified the forms, but I haven't done a full quantification of the pottery. And I've used that pottery and the stratigraphic relationships between the features, that main features that are recorded, to offer a phasing. And what I'll do now is just run you through the phasing for the site and what that seems to indicate for the development of the site. And we'll then come back to some more general issues and think about the finds at a later stage. Broadly, we have a site where the archaeology is dominated by earth-cut ditches. And in the earliest stage, and in all our plans here, the Windle Brook, now sort of turned into ponds and so on, is running across basically the top of the screen, and the edge of the plateau is marked by more or less the edge of the excavation up here. And in broad terms, most of our drawings are going to be concerned with this northern part of the site. The southern part of the site I'll only come to at a later stage, because they don't seem to be occupied, or at least we don't have features that were identified for those earlier periods. And the initial phases of Iron Age and Roman occupation, I should say there is some flint works, quite nice flint work from the site, indicating much earlier activity in the area. But the earliest phases we're seeing are late Iron Age into the 1st century AD. And the area here is dominated by one very large earth-cut ditch that's recut on a number of occasions, and a couple of earlier smaller sections of ditch, and a north-south piece coming down here. Now, clearly on this evidence, we can't say really very much of what's going on, although we can be pretty sure, I think, that we're dealing with a large complex enclosure system, as we see on so many later Iron Age sites in this part of the country. What comes from those deposits are a modest assemblage of Iron Age pottery. The style of that pottery, which ties in with other assemblages that I'm familiar with in the Basingstoke sort of northeast Hampshire area, are what I used to call saucepan pot continuum, sort of beyond the end of saucepan pots, leading into bead rim jars, which I believe, date from probably the 1st century BC into the 1st century AD. This is one of the areas where we need to do a little bit more work. I don't think it goes back much earlier than the 1st century BC, but I'm willing to be corrected on that. The second set of material, which I'll come back to towards the end of the lecture, is a very substantial quantity of ironworking debris, iron slag on a fairly grand scale, as we all see. Unfortunately, the rather acid soils in this area mean that we don't have any organic preservation. There's no bone that can be securely dated to the Iron Age and Roman phases. There is almost no metalwork. I say almost no metalwork because at the bottom of the screen here you see this very fine copy of a late Iron Age gold stator that came from an unstratified context, of course, on the site, is the only piece of good Iron Age Roman metalwork surviving, the gold presumably serving to protect the iron core from erosion. But the other sorts of things that we would expect on these sites with nails and bits of bronze and so forth have gone. The coin itself, and Colin Hazelgrove has looked at this for us, is a copy of a Dedomaris stator. It's actually one that is hubbed from existing coins. It's rather light in weight, so there are interesting discussion from Colin about whether the users of this coin would have been aware that it was not solid gold as it was being passed off as. He's fairly sure that they would have been aware of it. But that it fits in with this establishment of the site, probably in the 1st century BC, and the pottery from the period 1 deposits goes on to include some a variety of early bead rim jars and some neck jars, so suggesting we're going right to the end of the 1st century AD. There's then a period when those ditches are going out of use, being backfilled. It's possible, sorry, that it's possible that this ditch continued in use. We get another ditch parallel with it dug. What may be a little timber building here, though the evidence for that is, I think, not easy to evaluate. And over in the northwest corner, or north corner of the site, there's a little enclosure with a furnace cut into the top of one of the ditches. These are associated with absolutely typical 2nd century ceramic and material that goes down to the very early years of the 3rd century. It looks as though there is probably a decline in the use of the site at this stage, but as in later stages where there's apparent decline, I think we need to be very cautious because we're only seeing one chunk of what is quite clearly a much larger complex that spreads along the plateau edge. The furnace that is cut into the top of ditch 7 here is just a shallow feature with evidence of burning in it. I think during the excavation it was assumed or thought that this might be associated with iron smelting, but Sarah Painter and I are both in full agreement that this is not the sort of form that we would expect for iron smelting. It is much more likely to be something associated with crop processing so forth. And significantly, certainly in the surviving records, there's no evidence for any volume of slag associated with this. The next stage in the site, which runs through the 3rd century and up eventually to the mid-4th, sees a much more intensive period of activity. And essentially, we have a large enclosure that we've only got the western part of here, defined by ditch 10. Another enclosure that is defined by ditch 11, and presumably something to the south that we're not seeing. And within that, a very interesting complex of timber buildings that I'll come back to look at on the next slide in a moment. Those buildings, 2 successive buildings, continue probably sometime up into the middle of the 3rd century, but disentangling the precise chronology of those buildings has certainly defeated me. Those buildings then go out of use sometime, presumably in the late 3rd into the early 4th century, and the corner of the enclosure of the earlier phase here is demarked by a curved ditch which cuts through these earlier timber buildings, has a couple of drains associated with it, which could possibly be associated with another timber building here, but there's not enough to be certain of that. And then sometime probably in the after the 320s, towards the middle of the 4th century, the line of the enclosure is redefined by a ditch a little bit further to the west, and another timber building on a new axis is constructed overlying the period 3B ditch and the earlier houses, with a couple of drains associated with it. And this sequence in the center, which is the core of the excavations, produces some very interesting evidence for timber buildings. And this plan that Ellie has produced from using publication drawings that Geoff Cole himself had originally drawn enables us to look at those buildings in a little bit more detail. The earliest of them, building 2, is represented by a discontinuous ditch running through here, gap here, discontinuous ditch round here, another gap here, and in common with its successor, the short side of the building here wasn't identified. It's not, I suspect it was there, but is lost in the excavation. And this building illustrates in many ways the quality of some of the excavation, where the excavators were able to identify timbering and so forth in the ditches. And it makes it pretty clear that this is a sort of standard rectangular Roman rural building, about 8 meters by 16 meters, with a door midway along one wall, a door the other end wall here. The door in that wall is offset from the center line, which is more or less marked by this line of post holes running through here. So we can reconstruct this as having a ridge post roof that is supported on timbering that is set in the gully here. As I say, this is a form of building that is quite widely known in rural sites in Roman Britain now. What I would see as sort of ordinary farmstead type building with a hall that was undivided and is probably used for both domestic and working purposes. Sorry, we're sorry, my mouse is making this jump round. That building of period 3A is succeeded in the same phase by this much more substantial timber building, where we don't have evidence for the location of the door, and indeed the door cannot be in the middle of the side because there's a post support here. And that building seems to be formed very much along the style of aisled buildings elsewhere, but if you'll excuse the term, aisled building without the aisle. In other words, large stone post supports on which, again, evidence for the post was found, probably paired across the building here, like that, and the end wall built of a slightly lighter timbering. And again, we're missing the end wall here, but it turns round. So the gully around the outside, in contrast to the building 2, is not for holding the timbering in the walls, but is much more likely to be a drip gully from the roof. There's then the hiatus with ditch 12 here, cutting through things, and then this slightly smaller building of the middle of the 4th century, which again is very interesting. I think we have essentially a drip gully in the wall here, with again ridge posts running along the centre, indicating that it was a ridge-based structure. And what Geoff thought was a later sunken floor structure constructed on top of it, I'm sure is the floor of the building. So what we've got here is the base of a cob or earth wall with timber revetting round it. So a much smaller building, again, I assume domestic, of a type that is known from a few sites in Kent with sort of cob walls, but again suggests we're dealing with a relatively modest sort of rural settlement site. And as we'll see from the find later on, what we're seeing here is, if you like, a lower grade, if you like, peasant type farm or settlement site, rather than one of sort of high status. It's not impossible that there is higher status sort of building villa and so forth nearby, but there's no evidence to support that. And I think what we're seeing is one of these sites that we've become a little bit more familiar with in the last few years through developer-funded work across the country of lower status rural sites. The final phase of the settlement, we have, again, buildings going out of use, the continuation of the boundary here that had existed in the mid-4th century phase 3D, and apparently the construction of 2 trackways, one of which seems to be entirely new, the other one at the top here, in an area where the excavation didn't go very deep, I suspect may be a continuation of an earlier phase of trackways. And as far as I can see, the pottery from the site finishes being imported in the 3rd quarter of the 4th century, and then the site goes out of use. And I should say here that in the interim reports on the site and during the excavation, Geoff was very convinced that there was a early post-Roman phase, Anglo-Saxon, for want of a better word, phase, represented by these timber ghosts and, as we can see them here, these bulks of timber laid on the ground. And across the site, a number of linear features that were interpreted as palisade trenches. Having looked at the stratigraphy for this and looked at the alignment of these, I'm now convinced that these relate to the 19th century use of the site as market gardens, with these palisade trenches, clay filled, I think probably for supporting frameworks for growing plants, and I'm sure that these are the sleeper beams for shed. So we've lost the Anglo-Saxon phase, but we have some very interesting post-med stuff. And it's also worth saying at this stage that further ditches and other features right down in the southern part of the excavated area here are also undoubtedly 17th century or later on the basis of the pottery. So what do the finds from the site show us? Well, as well as giving us a very clear chronology for the site, the pottery, bearing in mind the limitations of the pottery study that I've already mentioned, do show two things about the assemblage as a whole. Firstly, as with the buildings, there is a very, very low proportion of fine wares and things like mortaria from the site. And that, together with the form assemblage, which certainly down to the middle of the 3rd century AD is almost wholly dominated by jars and a few dishes and bowls, suggests that we're dealing with something more at the lower end of the social spectrum, sort of peasant type site, rather than something that is elite. The other point that comes out from the pottery, and our site is basically in the middle of the 1978 OS map, Roman Britain here. The site is pretty marginal to other known settlement. And most of the pottery, as you would perhaps expect, comes from the Alice Holt Farnham kilns, which are not very far away. But there are very low quantities of material coming from further sort of south and west. There's a tiny amount of New Forest ware, which is quite prolific on other sites, I think, in the area. And there is evidence for links up into the north. So I suspect that we're seeing communication running up to Devil's Highway, possibly along the river valley down to the Way and into Staines here. We're getting material from the Oxfordshire kilns coming in. So there's indications, I think, tentatively, that the connections of the site are looking northwards. And that ties in interestingly with the core distribution of the Adedomaras coinage, where the one from this site is right on the southern edge of the distribution. But the most interesting, amazing set of material from the site is dominated by iron slag. Now this isn't just iron slag as you get on many sites associated with smithing. There is a certain amount of smithing slag here, but it's very large quantities of the stuff that can be phased and put to context. We've got 2.5 metric tons of slag, and there's certainly more around, much of which is derived from smelting the primary working of iron ores for producing iron. Sarah's work on that demonstrates that the technology that is used is one that is now relatively familiar from Britain and is distinctively Iron Age in tradition. So although quite a lot of the slag is coming from later deposits, where I think the slag is being used as building material for making floors and setting posts on and so forth, it is almost certainly wholly the product of production in the Iron Age, 1st century AD date. It is high phosphoric slag, and as we'll see in a moment, that gives us some clues to the origin of the ore that's used. And in addition to the smelt, there is good evidence for the working of that iron, not necessarily to make objects. There's a relatively small amount of smithing, so it's probably to turn the original smelt into material that could be traded and passed on. So we're talking here about a fairly significant late Iron Age iron production site. And that leads us to think about the broader context here. And if we go back to our map for a moment, although this is now a rather out-of-date map, it doesn't, the landscape hasn't changed very much. Most of the area in the Bagshot Bed, the north west Surrey heathland area is still relatively sparsely populated as far as we can see in the Iron Age and Roman periods. It's pretty poor agricultural land, prone to waterlogging and so forth, and as we know today, it's heathlands. And the site that we're looking at South Farm here, the excavation in this area, lies on the edge of that, on the edge of the Windle Brook, which if you look on British Geological Survey, is an area where there is a quite large amount of peat, at least originally, in the valley floor. And that is almost certainly the origin of the ore, which was probably bog ore that accumulated naturally in these sort of wetland peaty deposits. So the site that we're looking at is probably established to exploit those local raw material resources. And although the heathlands are agriculturally not particularly productive, they are good land for growing coppiced woodland, as happens in later periods, and production from that coppiced woodland of charcoal, which is what you need for these smelting purposes. So as well as the iron production indicating the productive economy here, it probably is also indicating something of the agricultural economy, which was probably based on arboriculture, the coppicing of woodland, and the production of wood resources and charcoal. And on parallel with work that I did many years ago in Eastern Yorkshire, where we have similar type of ecology, the production of woodland resources, charcoal and timber, continues into the early Roman period. And after the iron resources have gone out of use. And I suspect that the same is happening at the Lightwater site, where we've got that very fine set of timber buildings, where once established, the settlement continues, but the economy must shift. And I would surmise that it shifts towards an interest in woodland management, where the settlement is right beside the Windle Brook in a slightly marginal location from the heathlands. And that leads us to look a little bit further afield, and I'm grateful to Sarah for providing the information on this map, which shows that we're now beginning to see a pattern of quite extensive exploitation of local iron resources at the end of the Iron Age in the North Hampshire, North West Surrey and southern Berkshire area, of which Lightwater sort of fits in and ties in with the work that the Surrey Society did at Brooklands in Weybridge in the 1960s and 70s, where incidentally I did a few days digging when I was at school, so we come back in a circle here. And my suspicion on the basis of this evidence, the evidence of the Iron Age coin and the Iron Age, the Roman pottery, is that these production sites are looking northwards to the core Iron Age areas to the north of the Thames, and those connections are working in that direction rather than back towards the south west of the country. Although, of course, we have Silchester that comes in late in the Iron Age to this area and may be tied in with that. So I hope that what we've been able to draw out from the Lightwater excavation is something that is both interesting and significant in the locale, and also offers considerably more new information to tie into our broader understanding of what's going on in the late Iron Age and Roman periods in southern Britain. And I finish with just a sad point, in a sense. When I was musing over the extent of the enclosure systems that the excavation revealed during lockdown, I was wondering whether we could go out and do some magnetometry and map some of those ditches more extensively in the area of the Arboretum. And then I came across this rather sad map of, I think, December 1999 on Google Earth that shows the extent of landscaping that took place at that stage. And I suspect what this means, and again, the excavation area is in this part here, is that that work done by the Surrey Heath Trust in the 1980s, early 1990s, although it was done as a research and community project, it probably in the end was a rescue project, because the rest of the site has undoubtedly now got very little left that can be explored. So it shows the value of the sort of work that volunteers like those who worked on the site can do in contributing to our understanding of these landscapes and gathering really very important new information.